Elm Street was never a glamorous place. There were no towering skyscrapers or dazzling lights illuminating the night. It was an old working-class neighborhood where time had left its mark on every faded rooftop and every cracked road. Small convenience stores nestled under dim streetlights, and old utility poles creaked whenever the wind blew through. The residents of Elm Street weren't wealthy, but they all knew each other's faces. No one pried too deeply into anyone's life, but no one let another fall alone either. They lived by an unspoken rule. If you were decent, they would treat you decently. Tucked away in a street corner stood an old auto repair shop, its sign faded with time, the green paint peeling in small patches. The worn-out letters on the board still spelled out, Sam's Garage. People called the owner Samuel Brown. He wasn't the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. Tall but not particularly strong, with a weathered face marked by deep lines on his forehead and at the corners of his eyes. His hair was streaked with gray, his hands roughened by oil and years of labor. But what made people remember him wasn't his appearance. It was the way he lived, calm, quiet, and sincere. Samuel had moved to Elm Street about 5 years ago, buying the shop on his own. No one knew where he had come from, and no one asked. He never spoke of his past, and perhaps no one felt the need to hear it. To them, Samuel was simply a part of Elm Street, like the old trees lining the road, like the worn wooden benches outside the cafe at the end of the street. He lived alone in a small apartment behind the garage, a space so simple it was almost empty. A steel-frame bed pushed against the wall, a scratched wooden table, a few old books stacked next to a vintage radio. Every night when the streets fell silent, people could hear soft jazz tunes drifting from Samuel's room. Samuel rarely spoke about himself, but the entire neighborhood knew he was the most reliable man around. Whenever someone's car broke down, all they had to do was drop by Sam's garage, and Samuel would fix it, sometimes for an unexpectedly low price, sometimes for free. He never turned anyone away, whether it was a stranger or a child bringing in a bicycle with a flat tire. If someone didn't have enough money, he would simply wave a hand and say, "Pay me when you can." And if they forgot, he never reminded them. The kids in the neighborhood loved hanging around his garage. They weren't just fascinated by the cars, they were fascinated by Samuel Brown himself. They perched on old stools, eagerly throwing out the kind of questions adults never asked. "Mr. Sam, were you a soldier? Were you a race car driver before?" Samuel would only smile and shake his head. "I'm just an old mechanic." The adults would say, "Samuel Brown is a good man. He has nothing but a kind heart." But no one truly knew who Samuel Brown was. And then, on a night of light rain, a stranger knocked on his garage door. That was the night Samuel Brown's life changed forever. That night, Elm Street was unusually quiet. Light drizzle fell on the pavement, creating shimmering reflections under the dim yellow streetlights. Samuel Brown closed his shop later than usual. He threw an old rag over his shoulder, wiped the remaining grease from his fingers, and took a deep breath before heading out. The night was colder than usual, the wind rustling through the bare tree branches. Everything seemed as peaceful as any other day. But then, a small voice called out from the darkness, "Mister, please help me." Samuel turned around. Standing before him was a young man, drenched, hair disheveled, breath unsteady. His eyes darted nervously toward the road behind him, as if he had just escaped from something. Samuel didn't ask right away. He observed the young man for a moment before calmly speaking. "Something happened to you?" The young man swallowed hard, his voice trembling. I need a place to hide. Please, just for a little while." Samuel glanced at the empty road. In the distance, the sound of a car engine rumbled. A police siren echoed through the night. Headlights flickered in the rain, casting brief flashes against the worn-down buildings of Elm Street. He could refuse. He could pretend he had never seen the boy. But Samuel Brown had never turned his back on someone in need. So he nodded and opened the garage door. "Come in." The young man quickly stepped inside. Samuel shut the door and stood by the window, quietly watching the street. Moments later, a police car sped past the corner, its red lights flashing in the darkness. But they didn't stop. Samuel turned back. The young man stood in the corner of the garage, shivering from the cold. He let out a relieved sigh, but fear was still visible in his eyes. "Thank you. Thank you." His voice barely above a whisper. Samuel pulled out a chair and set an old coat on the table. "It's cold. Put this on." The young man took it with trembling hands. After a moment, as his breathing steadied, he looked up at Samuel. His eyes were full of gratitude, but also fear. Samuel remained still, his gaze calm. "What happened?" The young man hesitated, as if struggling to decide whether to tell the truth. But when he met the quiet eyes of the man before him, he let out a sigh. "I didn't do anything wrong, but they think I stole something." Samuel said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew everyone had their own story. He simply nodded, then turned to make a cup of hot tea and placed it on the table. The young man watched him, his eyes still filled with worry. Outside, the sirens faded into the distance until they disappeared into the night. Everything seemed back to normal. Only Samuel didn't know that the decision to help this boy that night would change his life forever. The next morning, Elm Street lay shrouded in a thin veil of mist, the pavement still damp from last night's rain. Samuel Brown unlocked the doors of his auto repair shop, just as he did every morning, paying no mind to what had transpired the night before. He had helped a young man in need, nothing more. It was what he had always done for anyone who needed a hand. He switched on the radio, letting the soft hum of old jazz tunes fill the quiet morning air. An old car had been parked outside since yesterday. Samuel crouched down, lifted the hood, and began inspecting the engine. His calloused hands moved with practiced ease, as if the world outside did not exist. Then the sharp crunch of tires on wet pavement made him pause. A police car pulled up, coming to a stop right in front of the shop. The doors swung open, and two officers stepped out. One older, his hair graying, his face stern. The other younger, his gaze sharp and watchful. They walked straight toward him. Samuel slowly straightened up, wiping his hands on the grease-stained rag draped over his shoulder. "Morning, officers, Carter." The older officer didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and spoke in a cold, clipped tone. "Mr. Samuel Brown?" Samuel nodded. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of grand theft." The air froze. Every sound around them suddenly felt distant. Samuel frowned, his confusion evident. What are you talking about?" The younger officer stepped forward, reaching for his handcuffs. "You've been accused of involvement in a theft at a local businessman's store. You have the right to remain silent." Samuel stared at them, his mind struggling to grasp what was happening. Theft? Since when? A light breeze swept through Elm Street, carrying whispers and curious glances from neighbors. A few windows cracked open, heads peeked out. Across the street, the old woman who ran the corner store, who had often brought Samuel homemade bread, stood with her mouth agape in shock. "What's going on?" someone murmured in the gathering crowd. "Why are they arresting Sam?" People began clustering together, their expressions clouded with uncertainty. Samuel Brown, the man they had trusted for years, was now being handcuffed in front of his own shop. Samuel took a deep breath, steadying himself. There must be some mistake, but the officers gave him no chance to explain. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrist with a sharp click. The street fell silent. No one protested. No one stepped forward to say Samuel Brown was innocent. The people who had once called him a good man now stood frozen, watching with hesitant, searching eyes. Some looked disbelieving, others seemed unsure, as if they were trying to recall whether they had ever truly known the man at all. Samuel scanned their faces, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alone. The officer opened the back door of the patrol car and pushed him inside. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed deep within Samuel's chest, like a judge's gavel sealing his fate. The police car drove off, leaving behind an empty repair shop in a street full of people torn between regret and suspicion. No one knew that this was only the beginning of the nightmare that awaited Samuel Brown. Samuel Brown never thought he would see a day like this, sitting on the defendant's bench, hands resting on his knees, eyes staring straight ahead like a stranger in his own life. The courtroom was a place so pristine it felt soulless. Bare white walls, polished wooden benches, everything designed to instill a sense of solemnity, yet unable to mask the truth beneath it. A trial whose verdict had been decided before it even began. On the judge's bench, William Green sat like a marble statue, his silver hair neatly combed, his face cold and impassive. His eyes held no empathy, only the gaze of a man who had seen too many criminals, or at least too many men who looked like Samuel to bother waiting for a verdict. At the prosecutor's table, a young lawyer in a crisp suit stood, adjusting his tie as if convicting an old man was just another routine task he needed to check off before lunch. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and sharp, like a well-honed blade. This case is quite clear. The defendant, Samuel Brown, harbored a known criminal within his business. Witnesses have confirmed this, and if I'm not mistaken, Your Honor, such an act is called— He paused for dramatic effect, then delivered his final blow. Aiding and abetting a fugitive under the law of the United States. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. In the gallery, the residents of Elm Street sat in silence. Some lowered their eyes, others exchanged glances. They weren't sure how to feel, shocked, skeptical, or simply resigned to what they had always been told to believe. On the witness stand, the man who had accused Samuel stood tall, his presence that of someone deeply wronged by society, though he was not the one in handcuffs today. "I saw that young man run into the defendant's shop," he stated with conviction, as if recounting fate rather than a simple event. "He was the one who broke into my store and stole my valuables. And when the police searched, he was gone, right there, inside Sam's garage." The prosecutor nodded as if that alone was enough to convict. "And are you certain that Samuel Brown was aware of the young man's crimes?" The witness shrugged, offering a knowing smirk. "Oh, come on," he sighed, shaking his head, as if the question itself was foolish. "We all know the kind of man he is." The words fell like a hammer's blow. The kind of man he is. 3 words heavier than any evidence, more damning than any argument Samuel could make. They required no proof, no rationale. They were a sentence unto themselves. From the gallery, a few Elm Street residents nodded, not because they were certain of Samuel's guilt, but because it made sense. Because how could a man like Samuel Brown, a black man, living alone, working quietly in a rundown repair shop, not be the kind of person who had something to hide? Judge Green remained silent. He didn't need to speak. The case had already been made. Finally, he turned his gaze to Samuel and spoke in a voice as dry as the pages of a law book. "Mr. Brown, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Samuel Brown slowly rose to his feet. He could tell them what had happened. He could say the young man that night was simply afraid, not a criminal. He could explain that he had no knowledge of the robbery, that he had done what any decent person would do, help someone trembling in the rain. But Samuel looked around the courtroom. No one truly wanted to hear the truth. Everyone already had their answer, and the truth was not part of it. At last, he simply said, "I am not guilty." The prosecutor chuckled, folding his arms. "Interesting, Your Honor, because I recall every criminal says that." Soft laughter spread through the courtroom. No one laughed loudly. They still had to appear serious. But each smirk and muffled chuckle built an invisible wall between Samuel and justice. From the bench, Judge Green gave a slight nod as if everything was now settled. "Mr. Brown," he said, his voice casual as though reciting a grocery list, "there are some things that cannot be denied." Samuel met his gaze. "Things like what?" Green tilted his head, offering a faint smile. "Things that were decided for you at birth." The air in the courtroom grew heavy. No one spoke, yet everyone understood exactly what he meant. Samuel did not frown. He did not protest. He had heard this too many times before. The judge lifted his gavel. "This court is adjourned. The final ruling will be delivered tomorrow." The officers stepped forward, locking cuffs around Samuel's wrists once more. The cold metal clinked like chains of the past, a familiar melody everyone knew, yet no one dared to name. They led him out of the court. No one looked up, because no one wanted to face what they had just done. Today is the day that will decide the fate of Samuel Brown. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Even though everyone knew that the verdict was practically predetermined, there was still a feigned sense of suspense in the way people sat and waited. A perfect script needed a fitting conclusion, and here they were simply waiting to hear the words "guilty" from Judge Green's lips. Samuel Brown didn't look at anyone. He just sat silently on the defendant's bench, hands clasped together, eyes staring straight ahead. The defendant was brought into the courtroom. The trial resumed. Judge Green slowly reviewed the files before him. He wasn't in a hurry. No one was ever in a hurry when victory was certain. "Defendant Samuel Brown," his voice rang out, authoritative and cold. "You have been charged with aiding and abetting theft based on the evidence collected and the testimony of the witness." He deliberately paused for a moment, as if to savor the absolute power he held at this moment. "I see no reason to prolong this trial any further." A few people nodded slightly. Some looked down, pretending to be regretful. No one spoke. No one objected. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. He was ready. But then the courtroom doors swung open. Everyone turned their heads. A man walked in. He was tall, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. But what silenced the room wasn't his refined appearance. It was the absolute confidence in every step he took. This was no ordinary man. He remained unfazed by the tension in the air. He walked to the center of the courtroom, faced Judge Green, and spoke in a calm yet sharp voice. "Your Honor, my name is David Bryant." The room buzzed with murmurs. Some people exchanged glances, others tried to recall where they had heard that name before. Judge Green raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. David Bryant gave a faint smile as if he was accustomed to such reactions. He pulled a folder from his leather briefcase and placed it firmly on the table. "I am here to clarify a truth that this trial seems to have overlooked." "And what truth would that be?" Green asked indifferently, though something in his tone no longer carried the same confidence as before. David turned to look directly at Samuel Brown. "The truth about the man sitting over there?" All eyes shifted to Samuel. David's voice was clear and sharp, like a blade slicing through the courtroom's artificial sense of justice. "Samuel Brown is not an unknown figure. He is not just a poor mechanic on Elm Street. In fact, he is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the technology industry." The room fell into complete silence. Some people frowned, others gaped in disbelief, while Judge Green sat motionless. "He is not only the owner of a leading tech company, but also a strategic investor in many important projects," David continued, his gaze sweeping across those who were now grappling with this revelation. "His total assets amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. But instead of living lavishly, he chose a simple life, investing most of his wealth into the community, helping those who never had a chance." These words struck the courtroom like an explosive revelation. Some people began whispering, and the judgmental glances from earlier turned into confusion. Judge Green blinked, then smirked as if trying to conceal his own unease. "Mr. Bryant," he said, his voice unnaturally composed, "are you trying to say that this man, whom the entire Elm Street community knows as nothing more than a mechanic, is actually a billionaire?" David didn't smile, nor did he falter. He placed both hands on the table, leaned forward, and looked directly into the judge's eyes. "Precisely. No one in the room dared to breathe." David picked up a document from his folder and held it up. "This is proof of Mr. Brown's assets, the companies he holds shares in, the charitable foundations he has established." He dropped the stack of documents onto the table with a sharp, resounding thud. "He is not a criminal." His gaze swept across the room, over those who had so quickly judged Samuel based on his appearance. "He is a great man whom all of you have misjudged." A few people lowered their heads. Some felt ashamed, but no one spoke. Samuel remained still. He showed no surprise, no pride. He simply looked at them all with a calm expression, as if he had known all along that this moment would come. Judge Green was silent. He had no choice but to open the files and carefully review every line. The silence stretched on. Then, after a few tense minutes, he took a deep breath and slowly struck his gavel against the bench. "This court is adjourned. We will re-examine all the evidence." With that, the carefully orchestrated farce he had controlled collapsed. Samuel Brown's handcuffs were removed right then and there. This time, as he stood up, every eye in the room was on him. But they were no longer filled with disdain. They were filled with fear, because they knew they had made a mistake, one that could never be undone. "Bah!" Samuel Brown said nothing. He just sat there quietly, observing everything unfolding around him. David Bryant slowly placed a small USB drive on the table in front of Judge Green. "Your Honor, this is the security camera footage from a camera near Sam's garage on the night of the theft." The entire courtroom started murmuring. Judge Green squinted, staring at the tiny USB as if it could change everything. David turned to the police chief present in the courtroom. "Officer, did your team review the security cameras in the area on that night?" The officer hesitated, then nodded. "We checked some cameras near the burglarized store." David raised an eyebrow as if waiting for a more specific answer. The officer sighed before reluctantly continuing. "But the camera near Sam's garage was broken at the time." A wave of unease spread across the room. Some people started to question how the police had investigated this case. David gave a faint smile. Fortunately, a neighbor nearby had installed his own security camera. He looked toward a man sitting among the audience. Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who had brought his car to Samuel's shop many times before. Mr. Peterson nodded in confirmation. "I have a camera installed on my window. The police never asked, so I never thought to check." A small shock rippled through the courtroom. David Bryant opened his laptop, connecting it to the USB. On the screen, the video started playing. The footage, taken from a high angle, showed the alleyway beside Samuel's garage. And in that video, the young man being chased never entered Sam's garage. He turned into the alleyway next to it. Samuel Brown never helped him escape. No one could say a word. The accuser, the shop owner who had been robbed, turned pale. The prosecutor searched for an argument, but could do nothing but gape in silence. Judge Green sat frozen, staring at the screen before turning to the police chief. Why wasn't this video included in the case file? The officer broke into a sweat, hastily replying, We didn't know it existed. David Bryant smirked. So none of you thought to check if there were other cameras in the area? No one answered, because the truth was now undeniable. Samuel Brown had not been arrested because there was evidence against him. He had been arrested because people had already assumed he was guilty. Yetun. Judge Green clasped his hands together, his face stiff with discomfort. But he had no other choice. With this new evidence, I declare the defendant, Samuel Brown, not guilty. The case is dismissed. The sound of the gavel striking the desk echoed firmly. Samuel's handcuffs were removed immediately. But this time, no one hurried out of the courtroom, because they all knew they had been wrong. Those who had doubted Samuel now lowered their heads, unable to meet his gaze. The grocery store owner wrung her hands in her apron, eyes red with guilt. She had believed the accusations. She had watched as Samuel was handcuffed and said nothing. And now she didn't know how to make things right. But Samuel didn't look at anyone with blame. He simply stood up, adjusted his shirt collar, and quietly left the courtroom. This time people looked at him differently. Yes, sir. Everything seemed the same, but in truth nothing was. At the corner of the street, Sam's garage was still open every day, but this time people didn't ignore it like before. Some walked in, not because they needed repairs, but because they wanted to say something they hadn't had the courage to say before. The grocery store owner placed a bag of pastries on the counter, awkwardly saying, "Thought you might need breakfast." Samuel looked at her for a moment before gently nodding. "Thank you." No blame, no anger, because true justice is not just about being proven innocent. True justice is when people realize they should never have doubted him in the first place. As Samuel closed his shop, a young boy ran by, stopping at the door with curiosity. "Mr. Sam, is it true that you used to be a billionaire?" Samuel smiled and shook his head. "I'm just an old mechanic." Then he stepped inside, closing the door to the past, and continued living the simple life he had chosen.